Rich millionaire chooses mistress over wife, only to regret and fight desperately to win her back. Daniel Bennett stood in his glass-walled office overlooking the city below. His tech company, Bennett Innovations, had grown from a modest startup to an industry powerhouse. Every decision, every deal had been meticulously planned. His ambition, once a driving force, had fueled his meteoric rise, but it had also begun to consume him. In the early days, Sophie had been his constant. She believed in him when no one else did, offering quiet support through the struggles. She was his rock, his source of warmth in a cold world. But as the company soared, Daniel became more consumed by his work, his focus shifting to the next deal, the next big move. Sophie noticed the change first, the distance that grew between them, the absence in his gaze, the silence at dinner. The man she had once shared everything with seemed to slip further away. Though Daniel still loved Sophie, the love had become secondary to his obsession with success. His dreams of power and wealth overshadowed everything, including their marriage. Over the years, small cracks appeared, unnoticed at first, but eventually deepening into a fault line. Sophie felt abandoned, the team they had once been now fractured. She had tried to reach him, to rekindle what they had, but he was always lost in his world of business. The tension between them became palpable, and though Daniel occasionally felt a pang of guilt, it was fleeting, replaced by the drive to conquer more. As Daniel's empire grew, he began to realize that in his pursuit of greatness, he had lost something far more valuable. The higher he climbed, the more he risked losing. And as Sophie sat alone in their empty home, she wondered how much of their love could still be saved. She had loved him deeply, but the cracks were too deep to ignore. The business conference was buzzing with energy, a gathering of industry leaders, innovators, and entrepreneurs. Daniel Bennett, a seasoned tech mogul in his early 40s, was a familiar figure in these circles. His company, Bennett Innovations, had become a powerhouse, a result of his relentless drive. But as he moved through the crowd, something felt amiss. Despite his success, Daniel felt an emptiness inside, a hollowness that couldn't be filled with business achievements or wealth. His thoughts kept drifting to Sophie, the woman who had supported him from the start, but whose presence had slowly faded from his life as his work consumed him. Their once vibrant connection had become distant and routine. As Daniel navigated the conference, his eyes met those of a younger woman across the room. Lily. She stood confidently among a group of colleagues, her energy magnetic. Daniel noticed her immediately, not just for her beauty, but for her carefree aura, which contrasted with his own more controlled demeanor. She exuded a youthful vitality that Daniel hadn't felt in years. Lily's attention was immediate, and her admiration for him was genuine. The way she spoke to him reminded him of how Sophie used to a feeling of being seen, of being admired. For a brief moment, Daniel felt validated, something he hadn't realized he was craving. Their conversation began professionally, but quickly grew personal. Lily's playful flirtation and subtle interest in him made Daniel feel alive in ways he hadn't in a long time. As the evening wore on, they exchanged numbers, and soon their interactions moved beyond business. Lily's texts grew more personal, and their meetings blurred the line between professional and personal. Sophie noticed the shift in Daniel. He was more distant, his attention often diverted to his phone. One evening, when Sophie asked about his messages, Daniel's response was casual but evasive. Sophie felt the growing gap between them, though she couldn't pinpoint its cause. As weeks passed, Daniel became more consumed by his growing connection with Lily. She made him feel seen and desired, something he hadn't felt from Sophie in a while. The temptation to pursue this new dynamic grew stronger, pulling him further away from the life he'd built with Sophie. Sophie tried to reconnect with him, but Daniel's focus was elsewhere. Lily had become the highlight of his day, and the temptation to escape his reality with her was irresistible. Daniel found himself questioning the man he had become. Was he still the person he once was, or had he lost himself in the allure of something new? With each passing day, Daniel moved further from Sophie, caught in Lily's web. The consequences of his actions were becoming clearer, but the pull of temptation was too strong to resist. Sophie returned home early from a business trip, a rare occurrence, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had followed her all day. The house was unusually silent when she arrived, and her pulse quickened as she heard muffled laughter from upstairs. Moving toward the sound, she reached the bedroom door and found Daniel tangled in bed with Lily, the woman who had slowly become the center of his attention. The betrayal hit Sophie like a wave, leaving her breathless and shattered. Daniel's eyes met hers, filled with shock and guilt, but also defensiveness. Sophie's voice trembled as she asked, "How long?" She couldn't process the magnitude of the betrayal. Daniel tried to explain, blaming her for being distant, but Sophie couldn't believe it. She had given everything to their marriage. As Lily casually defended their actions, Sophie's anger flared. She confronted Daniel, who seemed incapable of understanding the pain he had caused. After the confrontation, Sophie packed her things and made the painful decision to leave. The house, once filled with love, now felt empty, a reminder of the life she was leaving behind. She texted her best friend Anna, telling her she couldn't stay. Sophie stepped into the cool night, unsure where she was going but certain she had made the right choice. Daniel woke to the emptiness of their bed and soon saw Sophie's message. The weight of his actions hit him, and he searched the house in panic, realizing too late that he had lost everything. His affair with Lily had been a fleeting distraction, but it was Sophie, the woman he had taken for granted, who was truly gone. As the days passed, Daniel's life unraveled. His business faltered, and he realized that all the success he had built meant nothing without Sophie. He tried to reach her, but it was too late. Alone in the mansion, the lavish home that once symbolized his success now felt like a tomb, a hollow reminder of everything he had destroyed. The days stretched on endlessly for Daniel Bennett. The mansion that once echoed with the sounds of success, laughter, and luxury now stood silent, a hollow shell of its former grandeur. It was no longer a symbol of triumph, but a prison, trapping him in the reality of his own mistakes. The walls, which had once witnessed the building of an empire, now watched over a man who had lost everything that truly mattered. Lily had left him. The woman who had seduced him with her youthful energy, her promises of excitement and her validation, had found someone else, someone wealthier, more powerful, more capable of fulfilling her desires. Daniel had given her everything, had sacrificed his marriage, his self-respect, and his emotional connection with Sophie, and in the end, she had walked away without a second thought. When he had first realized Lily was no longer interested in him, the realization had come slowly, like the creeping fog that settles over a city in the early hours of the morning. At first, she had been distant, her calls fewer, her texts less enthusiastic. He had told himself that it was just a phase, that things would return to normal. But as the days went by, the absence of her presence, of the attention and excitement she had once given him, became impossible to ignore. Finally, she had sent him a brief message. "I'm seeing someone else. It's over." The blow hit Daniel with the force of a freight train. For weeks, he had allowed himself to be consumed by the affair, chasing after fleeting moments of passion and distraction, all the while convincing himself that he was in control. But now, in the cold aftermath of Lily's departure, Daniel found himself alone. He had lost her, but he had also lost something much more significant: the respect for himself, the trust of his business partners, and the only woman who had ever truly loved him, Sophie. The calls from his business partners started to become more frequent, but they were no longer the kind of calls Daniel had grown accustomed to. They were laced with concern, with hints of disappointment. His company, once a thriving tech empire, was now faltering under the weight of his distractions and neglect. The investors who had once hailed him as a visionary were now questioning his leadership, wondering if the man who had built the company from the ground up was the same man who now seemed so lost, so adrift. Daniel had always prided himself on his ability to solve problems, to rise to any challenge with unwavering determination. But now, when faced with the collapse of his personal life and the unraveling of his business, he found himself powerless. He had no answers, no solutions. He had nothing. And so, as he sat alone in his study, staring at the empty space around him, Daniel realized that he had hit rock bottom. He was no longer the man he had once been, the ambitious, driven entrepreneur who had conquered every obstacle in his path. He had lost his way, and in doing so, he had lost everything that had mattered. It was in the midst of this crisis, this deep sense of despair, that Daniel made a decision. He would seek help. It wasn't something he had ever considered before. Therapy had always seemed like a last resort, something for people who were too weak or too broken to handle their own problems. But now, in the face of his own emotional collapse, he knew that he had no other choice. The first appointment was awkward, to say the least. Daniel sat in a small, sterile office, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his body rigid with tension. He had always been a man who prided himself on his control, on his ability to master his emotions and keep his personal life separate from his professional one. But now, here he was, facing a therapist who had no interest in his business empire, who wasn't impressed by his wealth or his success. She simply wanted to understand the man behind the facade. The therapist, Dr. Helen Cartwright, was a woman in her late 40s with a calm demeanor and a sharp, analytical mind. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. As soon as Daniel sat down, she asked him to begin, to tell her what had brought him to her office. The question caught Daniel off guard. He had come here for answers, but now that he was faced with the opportunity to speak, he didn't know where to begin. He hesitated, his mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. But then, something shifted within him. Perhaps it was the exhaustion, the weight of the months of emotional turmoil finally catching up to him. Or perhaps it was the simple, undeniable fact that he had nowhere else to turn. Whatever it was, Daniel found himself speaking for the first time in what felt like years. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said, his voice strained. "I've spent my whole life building this empire, this life of success, but none of it means anything. I've lost my wife, I've lost my respect, and now my business is falling apart." Dr. Cartwright nodded, her gaze steady but compassionate. "It sounds like you're in a place of crisis, Daniel. And that's okay. A lot of people reach this point in their lives when they realize that what they've been chasing isn't fulfilling them. But this is the beginning of something important. This is where you can start to make sense of what's been happening." Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of her words. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to simply be vulnerable, to acknowledge the depth of his pain. "I've always believed that success was everything, that if I could just get to the top, if I could just prove myself, then everything else would fall into place. But now I realize it's not enough." Dr. Cartwright leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "What is it that you think you've been avoiding, Daniel? What part of you have you been running from all these years?" The question caught him off guard. He had never really considered it before, had never taken the time to reflect on the deeper emotions driving his actions. But as the words hung in the air, something inside him stirred. He realized that for most of his life, he had been afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of needing others, afraid of not being in control. His entire existence had been built around the idea of self-sufficiency, of never relying on anyone else for his happiness or fulfillment. And yet, in his pursuit of power and success, he had pushed away the people who mattered most, the people who had always been there for him. He had taken Sophie's love for granted, had neglected her needs, and in doing so had driven her away. I think I've been afraid," Daniel admitted, his voice quieter now, his words coming slowly, as if each one was a revelation. "Afraid of not being good enough. Afraid that if I let my guard down, if I let anyone see the real me, they would see how weak I am." "Doctor," Cartwright nodded, her expression sympathetic. It sounds like you've built a wall around yourself, Daniel, and that wall, as protective as it may have seemed, has kept you from connecting with others in a meaningful way. It's kept you from seeing the value of emotional intimacy, of being vulnerable and authentic with those you love. Daniel's heart raced as her words sank in. He had spent his entire life building walls, pushing people away, believing that his worth was defined by his achievements and his ability to control everything around him. But now, sitting here in this small office, he realized how much he had lost by living that way. "It's not too late to change, Daniel," Dr. Cartwright said gently. "But it will take time, it will take effort. You have to be willing to face the parts of yourself that you've been avoiding." Daniel nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. He didn't have all the answers, didn't know exactly how to begin, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the turning point. Maybe for once he could stop running from his fears and start living a life that was grounded in authenticity, in real connections, and in love. The days that followed were difficult. Daniel's therapy sessions became a place of reflection and deep self-examination. He began to confront the insecurities that had driven his behavior, the fears that had fueled his ambition, and the emotional wounds that had led him to neglect the people who mattered most. It was painful work, and there were times when Daniel wanted to give up, to retreat back into the safety of his old habits, but something inside him kept pushing forward. As the weeks passed, Daniel began to change. He made an effort to be more present with the people in his life, to listen rather than speak, to show vulnerability instead of hiding it behind the walls of his success. He began to understand that true fulfillment didn't come from external achievements, but from the relationships he nurtured and the authenticity he embraced. Slowly but surely, Daniel started to rebuild not just his business, but his sense of self. He realized that the path to success was not a straight line, but a journey filled with setbacks, failures, and growth. And for the first time in years, he was ready to embrace the unknown, to let go of the need for control, and to face the world as the man he had always wanted to be. A man capable of love, of vulnerability, and of true connection. The days following Daniel's breakthrough in therapy were both an awakening and a burden. Each morning, he woke with a renewed sense of purpose, but also with the heavy weight of the past bearing down on him. He had spent years building an empire of success, but now he found himself standing at the ruins of his personal life, trying to salvage what little he had left. It was clear to him that words alone would not suffice. No amount of apologies could undo the damage he had done to Sophie, to himself, and to those he had pushed away in his relentless pursuit of ambition. Daniel had always believed that if he could fix a problem, he could control the outcome. But now he understood that some things, especially love and trust, could not be fixed with quick solutions or polished speeches. They were fragile, built over years of shared experiences, and once broken, they could not be mended overnight. It would take time, and it would take a transformation from within. The first step, Daniel knew, was to face the people he had hurt along the way, the friends, the colleagues, the ones who had supported him when his focus had been elsewhere, when his world had revolved solely around his own desires and ambitions. He had been blind to the consequences of his actions, and now he had to reckon with them. He began with his business partners. They had stood by him through the highs and lows of his career, but his neglect of their trust and his obsession with personal distractions had strained their relationships. The meetings he once dominated with confidence now felt like exercises in self-loathing. Each apology, each attempt to make amends, seemed both insufficient and overwhelming. They were, to put it plainly, uncomfortable. But Daniel faced them head-on, acknowledging his mistakes without excuses, apologizing for the ways he had let them down, and asking for their forgiveness. Some were open to reconciliation, while others remained distant. But even in their silence, Daniel knew that this was a necessary step. After his meetings with his colleagues, Daniel turned inward, reaching out to his childhood friends, those who had known him before the wealth, before the fame, and before the man he had become. He had distanced himself from them for years, assuming they couldn't understand the pressures he was facing. But now, in the clarity of his newfound self-awareness, he saw how much he had isolated himself from the very people who cared about him. The reunions were emotional. His friends didn't expect grand gestures. They didn't need him to prove anything. They simply needed to hear him speak the truth, something he had avoided for so long. Daniel apologized deeply, acknowledging that he had allowed ambition to corrupt his relationships, that he had been selfish and dismissive of their feelings. He didn't expect immediate forgiveness, but the honesty in his words opened a door for healing. Slowly, they began to rebuild their trust in him, but the hardest confrontation of all remained. Sophie. Daniel knew that no amount of public apologies, no amount of grand gestures would undo the damage he had done to their marriage. She had been the one constant in his life, the one person who had believed in him when no one else did. And yet he had let her slip away, so consumed by his need for control and validation that he had destroyed everything they had built together. He wrote her a letter unlike any he had ever written before. His words were raw and vulnerable, unguarded in a way that he had never allowed himself to be. He admitted the depth of his mistakes, expressing how deeply sorry he was for betraying her trust, for taking her love for granted, for pushing her aside when she needed him the most. But he didn't stop there. He didn't just apologize. He poured his heart out, telling her how much he loved her, how he had been a fool to think he could find fulfillment in anything or anyone other than her. He spoke of the man he was becoming, of the changes he was committed to making not just for her, but for himself. His hands shook as he sealed the envelope, his heart heavy with the fear that the letter would go unread, that his words would fall on deaf ears. But he sent it anyway, knowing that he had to try. Sophie, on the other hand, was in the midst of a complicated emotional battle. After Daniel's betrayal, she had taken the necessary steps to rebuild her own life. She had left the mansion, the life they had shared, and sought solace in her work, in her own passions, and in the pursuits she had put on hold for far too long. She had once dreamed of opening her own art gallery, a dream that had been eclipsed by Daniel's ambitions and the demands of their marriage. But now she found herself finally pursuing that dream, working tirelessly to create a space for emerging artists, a place that reflected her own vision and creativity. In the weeks following her separation from Daniel, Sophie had begun to heal, though the wounds of the past still haunted her. She had built a new life, but it was fragile. There were moments of doubt, moments where she questioned if she had made the right choice in leaving. She still loved Daniel. Her heart ached for him, for the man he had been, and for the man he could still become. But she also knew that love alone wasn't enough. Trust, once shattered, was not easily repaired. The letter from Daniel arrived on a day when Sophie was particularly vulnerable. She had been grappling with the demands of her new life, trying to juggle her career, her gallery, and the emotional weight of her decision to leave. The letter arrived at a time when she was reflecting on the past, thinking about the life she had shared with Daniel, the dreams they had once talked about, and the love they had once shared. She sat on the couch, the letter in her hands, her mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. She was torn between the woman she had become, strong and independent, and the woman she had been, someone who had given everything for love, for her marriage, for Daniel. It was difficult to reconcile these two versions of herself, the one who had walked away and the one who still felt the pull of her past. As she read Daniel's words, she felt a mixture of emotions. There was anger, certainly, anger at the betrayal, at the lies, at the hurt that had been caused. But there was also sadness, a deep ache for the love that had once been so pure, so undeniable. And there was a glimmer of hope, the faintest whisper that perhaps, just perhaps, Daniel could change. That he could become the man she had always known he could be, the man who had once cared deeply for her, who had supported her dreams and shared her vision for the future. But Sophie knew that the road to healing would not be easy. Her heart was still scarred, and she wasn't ready to simply forgive and forget. She had fought too hard to reclaim her own happiness, to build a life that was hers and hers alone, to risk it all again on a promise of change. In the weeks that followed, Sophie didn't respond to Daniel's letter right away. She took her time, reflecting on the past, considering the future, and most importantly, listening to her own heart. She wasn't sure what she wanted, what the right decision was. She still loved him, but she had also learned to love herself in a way that she never had before. Meanwhile, Daniel was doing everything he could to show her that he had changed. He started volunteering in causes Sophie cared about, hoping to prove that he was no longer the man who had ignored her dreams, her needs. He worked at a local shelter, helping women who had been through difficult times, offering mentorship to young men who needed guidance, anything that would demonstrate his commitment to becoming a better person. But it wasn't about grand gestures or public displays of goodwill. It was about the quiet moments, the simple acts of kindness, the willingness to show up and be there for others, to be present in a way he had never been before. It wasn't just about making up for the past, it was about proving, through his actions, that he had truly transformed, that he was no longer the man who had betrayed Sophie, but someone who had learned from his mistakes and was ready to be a better partner, a better man. The road to redemption was long, and it was still uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a sense of peace, a sense of purpose. He knew that the journey wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to walk it one step at a time if it meant he could win back Sophie's trust and perhaps rebuild the love they had once shared. The autumn air was crisp, the kind that carries a quiet promise of change. Daniel stood at the entrance of the park, his hands in his pockets, feeling the soft weight of time upon him. This place, the park where he had first met Sophie, held memories, both sweet and painful, of their beginnings. It was here that they had shared innocent laughter, long walks, and tender moments of connection. Now, years later, it felt like a full circle had been completed, though it had come with a great deal of suffering, self-discovery, and painful choices. Daniel looked around the park, noting the way the trees had begun to shed their leaves, a symbol of the change he had gone through. Once, he had been a man who prided himself on his wealth, on the empire he had built from the ground up. But now, that empire seemed hollow, a facade that had crumbled with the weight of his own mistakes. He had lost much: his business, his fortune, his sense of self. But in the process, he had gained something far more valuable: clarity. It was no longer about the money, the power, or the prestige. Those things had once been his markers of success, his way of measuring his worth. But now they felt like nothing more than distractions, illusions that had kept him from seeing what truly mattered. The love of his life, the woman he had promised to cherish, had slipped through his fingers, gone because of his own selfishness, his hunger for validation and control. But he had realized, after months of soul-searching and making amends, that none of those external measures of success could replace what he had lost. He needed Sophie, her love, her trust, and the chance to prove that he could be the man she deserved. He needed her, not as a possession or an ideal, but as a partner, someone to walk beside him through life, without pretense, without distractions. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned, and there she was, Sophie. She was standing at the edge of the path, looking at him with a mixture of hesitation and something else. Something softer, something that hinted at the possibility of healing. His heart skipped a beat as their eyes met. She was still the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago, strong, graceful, and beautiful. But she had changed, as he had. She was no longer the woman who would stand by his side no matter the cost. She had learned to protect herself, to shield her heart from the same betrayal that had once wounded it. "Sophie," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. His hands trembled slightly, but he held his ground. He had spent months working up to this moment, preparing himself to be vulnerable in ways he had never been before. She nodded, taking a few steps forward. "Daniel," she said, her voice steady but laced with a hint of sadness. "I didn't think we'd ever meet like this again." "I know," he replied, his gaze never leaving hers. "I didn't think we would either. I didn't think I'd ever be standing here, asking for a second chance. But here I am." Sophie paused, taking a deep breath as if to steady herself. She had spent so long moving forward, building a life on her own terms. Without him, the thought of turning back, of letting him back into her heart, was both comforting and terrifying. She had spent years loving Daniel, believing in him, supporting him, but she had also spent years losing pieces of herself in the process. She had to ask herself, not just if she could forgive him, but if she could trust him again, if she could love him without fear of him breaking her once more. Daniel stepped closer to her, his hands at his sides, but his eyes pleading. "Sophie, I can't change the past. I can't erase the pain I caused, but I've changed. I've learned so much about myself, about what really matters. All the wealth, all the success, it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is you. What matters is us. And I know it's going to take time, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm not the man I was. I'm not the man who took you for granted. I'm not the man who hurt you. I am someone else now." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. A part of her wanted to believe him. A part of her still loved him with all her heart. But another part of her was scared of opening herself up to him again, scared of being vulnerable to someone who had once shattered her trust. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't know if I can trust you again. You hurt me. You left me. You broke everything we built. And I've spent so long rebuilding my life on my own, trying to make myself whole again." Her words stung, but Daniel didn't flinch. He had no right to expect anything from her, no right to demand forgiveness. He had to let her speak, to let her express the pain he had caused. "I know," he said quietly. "I know, and I don't expect you to just forgive me, because I say I've changed. I know it's going to take time. I don't have a magic answer, Sophie. All I can offer is my truth. I want to rebuild what we had, but I want to do it right this time. I want to show you that I can be the man you deserve, not just through words, but through actions." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she struggled to contain the rush of emotions flooding through her. She had been so sure that walking away was the right decision, that she was better off without him. But now, standing before him, she couldn't deny the longing in her heart, the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for them. She loved him. She always had. And yet, part of her wanted to protect the life she had built for herself, the independence she had gained, the sense of self that had emerged in the absence of their marriage. "I don't know what to say," Sophie murmured, wiping away a tear. "I've built a life without you, Daniel. I've started over, and I'm scared that if I let you in again, I'll lose myself. I can't go through that again." Daniel reached out slowly, cautiously, as if afraid that the smallest gesture might shatter the fragile connection between them. But Sophie didn't pull away. Instead, she met his gaze, her eyes filled with both pain and hope. "I'm not asking you to lose yourself," Daniel said, his voice full of sincerity. "I'm asking for a chance, just a chance to show you that I'm worthy of your trust, that I'm worthy of your love. You don't have to make any decisions today. I'll be here, waiting, doing everything I can to prove that I'm not just asking for your forgiveness, I'm asking for your partnership, your companionship, and your heart." Sophie swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so long fighting for her independence, for her own happiness, that the idea of letting someone else back in was terrifying. But she couldn't ignore the truth that had been sitting in her heart all along. She had loved him once, and despite everything, she still loved him now. "I can't promise you everything, Daniel," Sophie whispered, taking a step closer to him. "But I can promise that I'm willing to try. We both have so much to heal from, so much to rebuild. I don't know if we'll ever get back to what we had, but I'm willing to find out. But you have to know this. I won't tolerate being treated as an afterthought again. This time, it has to be different." Daniel's eyes softened, his heart swelling with gratitude and relief. "I promise, Sophie. This time, it will be different. I'll show you every single day how much you mean to me. I'll prove to you that I can be the man you've always deserved." Sophie nodded, a small but hopeful smile forming on her lips. There was still so much to rebuild, so many broken pieces to mend. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like they had a chance, a real chance. Without another word, they took each other's hands. No more promises, no more grand gestures, just the quiet, steady steps of two people who had been through the fire and were now, together, beginning to rebuild. The road ahead would be difficult, but as they walked side by side through the park, under the canopy of trees, they knew one thing for certain: this time they would walk it together. And that, for now, was enough. As they walked away from the park, hand in hand, the world around them felt different, calmer, quieter, as if the weight of the past had finally been lifted, leaving only the possibility of the future. A future where love, trust, and mutual respect were no longer just distant hopes, but a living reality. As the months passed, Daniel and Sophie navigated the delicate terrain of rebuilding their relationship, each step marked by vulnerability and an evolving understanding of one another. Their connection, once forged in the fires of passion and ambition, was now tempered with the soft warmth of honesty and self-awareness. It was a different kind of intimacy, one born not out of idealization or dependency, but out of a mutual commitment to growth both as individuals and as partners. Daniel's transformation had not been easy. It was not a simple matter of a few heartfelt apologies or grand gestures. It was an ongoing process, a daily choice to be present, to listen, to learn, and to let go of the old patterns that had driven him to self-destructive choices. His business, which had once consumed him, now felt like a secondary concern, important, yes, but not the defining factor of his life. The true work was in understanding himself, in discovering the man he could be without the facade of success or the chase for external validation. He had spent so much time in his life thinking that happiness and fulfillment were things to be acquired, things to be worked for, attained through wealth, prestige, and recognition. But as he walked the path of personal growth, he learned that true fulfillment was not something you could collect or control. It was something that emerged organically from within, nurtured by love, by connection, and by the courage to face one's deepest fears and insecurities. It was a quiet Wednesday evening when Daniel found himself sitting on the porch of the house he and Sophie had once shared, now their home again. The night was still, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. Sophie was inside, preparing dinner, something simple, something homemade. In the kitchen, there was no tension, no lingering resentment. There was only the hum of the evening, the soft rhythm of their shared space. As Daniel watched the fading light of day, he reflected on the journey they had taken together. They had rebuilt their trust, but more importantly, they had rebuilt themselves. Sophie had become a mirror for him, showing him the beauty of vulnerability, the courage it took to face one's fears and uncertainties. She had learned to protect her heart, yes, but she had also learned to open it again. And as they had slowly, gently opened up to one another, they had found something deeper, something more lasting than the love they had shared before. The growth in their relationship was not without its struggles. There were moments of doubt, of frustration, when old wounds would reopen or old habits would resurface. But there was also a resilience between them now, a strength that came not from the idealization of one another, but from the acceptance of their flaws, their imperfections. It was a love that was grounded in reality, in understanding that no one is perfect, but that in choosing to grow together, they could create something beautiful and lasting. Sophie, too, had changed in profound ways. Her time apart from Daniel had been a journey of rediscovery. She had stepped away from the woman who had sacrificed herself for the sake of others and had begun to carve out a life that was truly her own. She had rediscovered her dreams, her passions, the things that had been put on hold during her years of supporting Daniel's ambitions. She had learned that love could be a partnership, not one-sided, not a dependency, but a shared journey where both partners could thrive. She had found peace in her own independence, but she had also learned the delicate balance of sharing her life with someone else, someone who respected her autonomy and honored her growth. With Daniel, she had found a new sense of trust, a trust that was not about control or fear of abandonment, but about mutual respect and support. The Sophie who had once been afraid of being let down was now a woman who had the courage to be open, to love without conditions, but with the wisdom to protect her heart. One evening, as they sat together at their small dining table, Daniel turned to Sophie, his eyes soft with emotion. He had learned to express himself in ways he never had before, ways that were not about showing his strength, but about revealing his vulnerability. "You know," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "I used to think that success was about conquering the world, about being the best at everything I did. I thought that if I just had more money, more recognition, more power, then I would be happy. But now I see that true wealth is in the moments we share, the connections we make, and the love we give and receive. That's what really matters." Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and love. "I've always known that," she said softly, "but I think you're just starting to see it for yourself. And that's the most beautiful thing." Their gaze lingered on each other, and in that moment it was clear that they had both found something greater than they had ever imagined possible. They had found a love that wasn't dependent on external achievements, a love that was rooted in mutual respect, in emotional connection, and in the shared understanding that their individual journeys were just as important as their shared one. Daniel had learned to embrace vulnerability, to face his insecurities head-on, and to recognize that his worth was not tied to the size of his bank account or the success of his business. He had come to realize that his greatest achievements were not the accolades or the deals he had closed, but the relationships he had nurtured, the person he had become, and the love he had earned. And for Sophie, the journey had been one of reclaiming her own identity, of learning to live for herself as much as for the people she loved. She had learned that love did not mean self-sacrifice, that it was possible to be a whole person within a partnership, to stand strong in her own right while being open to sharing her life with someone else. Together, they found balance between ambition and love, between personal growth and shared connection. They had learned that it was not about choosing one over the other, but about integrating both into a life that was rich with meaning, purpose, and depth. Their relationship blossomed, not in the way they had expected, but in a way that felt more authentic than ever before. They had weathered storms, faced their darkest fears, and emerged stronger for it. And as they looked ahead, they knew that their love would continue to evolve, to grow, to change. But it would always be grounded in the lessons they had learned along the way, that true wealth lies in human connection, that personal growth is the greatest achievement one can strive for, and that love, in its truest form, is a journey, not a destination. In the quiet moments of their life together, they would often look back and marvel at how far they had come. They had once been lost in the pursuit of success, blinded by ambition and fear. But now they had found something much more valuable, a love built on honesty, respect, and a commitment to growing together every single day. And as they continued to walk forward hand in hand, they knew that the future was theirs to shape, not because they had conquered it, but because they had learned to embrace it with all its challenges and all its beauty. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. In the end, although the road to healing love is not easy, Daniel and Sophie have proven that when we know how to admit our mistakes and change ourselves, everything can start from the beginning. Their love is not only loved, but also becomes stronger and more genuine than ever. This story shows that past mistakes are not the end, but an opportunity for us to learn and grow. If you find this story meaningful and inspiring, don't forget to subscribe to follow more profound and touching stories. Please share this video to spread the message of visibility and true love.